Hello, my name is Victoria, and this week I'll be discussing the two pieces from class. The first piece that I'll be discussing is When Male Writers Confront Toxic Masculinity by Philip Sawyers. And the second piece that I'll be discussing is The Feminist by Tony Chulafmut. One thing that I admired about these pieces is that they encouraged a reflection of toxic masculinity within our own lives. Both pieces mirrored similar ideas, but also had a different take on toxic masculinity as well. I like how the article, When Male Writers Confront Toxic Masculinity, identifies the reactions of men whose ideologies do not fit the feminist perspective find ways to weaponize these movements. For example, these men weaponize the Me Too movement by making it a difficult time to be a man, rather than a difficult time to be a woman. I also enjoyed how the piece brought into perspective that these men are easy to identify. However, these faux hypocrite progressives make it harder to identify who's a real feminist. The article gives examples by calling out a comedian who boldly proclaims feminism on stage, but has multiple sexual abuse allegations towards him. Or even our Prime Minister, who proclaims to have a gender balance cabinet, but fails to mention his past as a brown face or a black face. This links well into the feminist piece because it demonstrates more of the everyday hypocrites that we may come across. The feminist introduces how certain men may lie about being feminists to get laid. I think everyone has experienced this in some capacity, whether in high school or in university. We all know a man who pretends to be a feminist to impress peers or even girls, but highly engages in locker talk, which is degrading to women. Although this is a common experience, I love how these two pieces identify how disgusting this behavior is. And it really demonstrates how this behavior is ongoing in our society today, even if we turn a blind eye to it. As a society, male and female, we often turn a blind eye to these people. But these pieces of literature demonstrate how harmful this behavior is to our society, to ignore these types of individuals. Additionally, I like how Philip Sawyers describes how white privilege has immense power, and that they can demand attention with their voice. Even as disturbing as this thought is, it reminds us how powerful and how much of a positive change that these men can make. But more importantly, Sawyers identify that this privilege cannot be distinguished by feminist views. I think it is important to identify because this shows that privilege will not go away just from a change of ideology, but from men showing examples and acting on values that they believe in a feminist ideal. However, if these white men start acting and believing in this feminist change, then a slow change will occur in society. But these changes are only possible if these men talk about their values and demonstrate them into society with no gain for their own personal or relationship quota. Philip Sawyers discusses that for this to happen, most necessary conversations about masculinity is also the conversation that makes men the least comfortable and that provokes pushback. But it also involves some uncomfortable self-criticism and willingness to implicit oneself. But this struggle doesn't just exist within men, but within women as well, and our society as a whole, as our tolerance of certain behaviors allow them to continue. For example, I noticed while reading this article that I had to be more critical of myself and how I view toxic masculinity, even though I didn't believe my view was toxic at all. For example, on New Year's Eve, I was out with my boyfriend in a bar, and we went in the smoking area because I needed a little bit of air because it was hot and stuffy. As I was walking outside, someone that had obviously had a bit too much to drink swung his arm out and hit his cigarette butt on my leg as I was walking past. And since I was wearing a dress, the cigarette burn was quite painful. As I was humiliated and crying from the pain, I was angry and I desperately wanted someone to do something. And in that case, I wanted my boyfriend to do something. I felt at the moment I wanted him to start a confrontation or commit some type of violence on my behalf to defend my honor. I realized when reading this article, at the time I didn't even find this behavior I wanted to do was toxic. I just thought he'd be defending me. But having these ideas on how men have to defend women in a violent way encourages these stereotypes of toxic masculinity. Although this may not be the case of every female, this article allowed me to reflect on my own behavior and my own ideas of toxic masculinity and how I even need to adapt with a new perspective. This article made me realize that no matter how pro-feminist I was and how much I advocate for women's rights, there was still a part of me that encouraged a small piece of toxic masculinity. I feel that Philip Sawyers' works encourages others to look deep within themselves, and that's what makes this article so powerful. Philip Sawyers does this because he engages the reader to think about their own actions and beliefs and how they can be problematic, whether they see this or not. The feminist also engages the reader in this way. For example, after his friend woke up from a man who was sexually abusing her, after he told her he just wanted to sleep over, but he said he was overcome with raw animal passion and couldn't help himself, but ended up abusing her as she slept, and she still let him stay. She replied with, "Whatever, we'll probably be married in 3 years anyways." I was disgusted while reading this, but I soon realized that women make these excuses for men constantly. Whether at this scale or not, women still do it. There are perhaps many reasons why women do this. One, because it is less painful and less problematic to their social and professional status, but also because it may be difficult for people to understand them. Or even worse, these women will get blamed for the assault because they let these men sleep over, and perhaps that's the main reason why women pretend to be okay with these acts. Also, I like how the feminist illustrates what a feminist morality would look like. The author goes into a third point of view, so it is up to the reader to understand the feelings that the characters had, and also the feelings that people had towards the character, as the book doesn't give us a clear understanding of these things. We get mostly positive views of the character in the beginning. Even when he tries to date girls and he is rejected, he does so very respectfully. But he attributes this rejection to the fact that he has narrow shoulders, and not towards his personality or anything else. Throughout his early life, he seems to defend feminist views, even from coworkers who tease him by saying, "You asked if you can kiss her, and you don't do that." They even taunt him by saying, "Why should we listen to your advice? We get the girls." I think this imagery really identifies how certain people can be picked on for having feminist views, or even teased, and that's why these views are not popular, because in this instance, even though he has these views and he's strong by them, he's still getting teased because he's not getting as many girls, and therefore what he's doing isn't successful, and that makes his feminist point of view seem flawed or unsuccessful. However, halfway through the narrative, we see that his character, as he grows older, starts to become a little more bitter. His friends start to lose respect for him by telling them that he self-sabotages, and they claim, "You've turned your loneliness into this, fetish necklace of martyrdom." I wondered if this ideology of feminism can make someone, which in turns this moral high ground into something that's more self-satisfying and not towards the actual good of this perspective. If their life is not successful romantically, does it give them the right to turn into a martyr and believe that the world owed them something because they treated women with respect? This really made me reflect on the fact that feminism could be seen this way, that men, women, anyone in general could see themselves as better, and that the world did owe them something because they followed this positive perspective. I think it's a flawed characteristic as a society that we as a human race have positive qualities and believe that the world should owe us something because of them. But it made me think of how, if feminism could be used this way, how toxic this could be. And this character demonstrates that through his kind of narcissistic feelings toward feminism towards the later bits of the piece. In the piece, the character starts to blame the women on their on their bad preferences that may have been engraved from them from a society that was ruled by the patriarchy. But he believes that women as moral agents are equal to men. The character starts to see himself as someone who combated misogyny both on the world and within himself. Here we can identify the blames of one situation on the patriarchy and not on his own behaviors that maybe made him undateable. This view is very narcissistic and shows a different side of someone who has feminist views. Although I liked the feminists at first, by the end I was disgusted on how narcissistic the ideology of feminism became to this individual. Just as Philip Sayer's piece describes how these hypocrites exist, the feminist describes what this would look like in a feminist morality. Finally, I found it interesting that both pieces ended on the idea that the most hurtful behavior towards women today is catcalling, microaggressions, and mansplaining. I found it intriguing that both pieces ended on the same idea. However, I do completely agree that these are extremely hurtful to women. In professional environments, these behaviors are still seen today. Men still discriminate against women in society and use these new forms of oppression to do so. I like how both of these pieces single out this new form of oppression. Even though they do not follow up on these big ideas, it is important that they still mention them. Thank you for listening to my presentation.